Have you ever noticed how some people decide who you're going to be before you even had a chance to become who you are? They look at where you were born. They look at who raised you. They look at your mistakes. They look at your trauma. They look at your setbacks. They look at your family. And somewhere in their mind, they make a decision about you. Oh, she'll never make it. He'll never change. They're never going to become anything. And the crazy part is that most of the time, they don't even realize that they're doing it. They just assume. They assume that your beginning is your ending. They assume your struggle is your identity. They assume that your pain is your potential. And maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you had people look at where you came from and decide where you're going. Maybe you've had people look at your trauma and decide your worth. Maybe you've had people look at your failures and decide your future. And let me tell you something. Some of the strongest people you will ever meet are the people who are underestimated the most. The people who society counted out. The people who weren't supposed to rise. The people who weren't supposed to heal. The people who weren't supposed to succeed. The people who were supposed to accept what life handed them and stay exactly where they were. And here's what they never expected. They never expected you to wake up. Once a person like that wakes up, everything changes. And you know what's interesting? When you've been through a lot in life, people stop seeing your potential and start seeing your history. They don't see who you could become. They see where you've been. They don't see your strength. They see your wounds. They don't see your future. They see your failures. And after hearing that long enough, something dangerous starts to happen. You start believing it too. You start asking yourself, maybe this is just who I am. Maybe this is all life is ever going to be. Maybe everybody was right. Think about that for a second. Not because it's true, but because if you believe it, you'll never discover what you're actually capable of. And that's what happens to so many people. They don't lose because they're incapable. They don't lose because they're weak. They lose because they accepted a story that was never theirs to begin with. A story written by family. A story written by society. A story written by people who projected their own limitations onto them. But here's where things start to change. Because there comes a moment where someone who's been through hell asks a different question. Not, why did this happen to me? But what if this isn't the end of my story? And that question changes everything. Because here's what people underestimated. They thought your pain would destroy you. What they didn't realize was your pain was training you. You see, they thought that your setbacks were proof that you couldn't win, but you were learning. They thought that your failures made you weak, but you were becoming resilient. They thought every loss was a loss, but every loss was actually a lesson. Think about that. Who develops strength? The person whose life was easy? Or the person who had to survive things that never should have had to survive? Who develops grit? The person who always had support, or the person who learned how to keep going when nobody was coming to save them? You see, what they never realized is that when you've spent your entire life overcoming things, you develop something most people never do. Resilience, adaptability, persistence, the ability to suffer and still continue, the ability to fail and still believe, the ability to lose and still create. And that's why the underdog becomes dangerous. Not dangerous because they're destructive, dangerous because they're unstoppable. And here's something else people don't realize. Most people don't put you in a box because they understand you. They put you in a box because it makes them feel safe. Think about that. Because if the person who came from trauma can heal, if the person who was rejected can become confident, if the person who was counted out can succeed, then what excuses do they have? And that's where people become super uncomfortable. Because your growth forces them to confront their own limitations. Your success forces them to question their own excuses. Your healing forces them to face their own wounds. And that's why people will fight so hard to keep you in a box they built for you. Because if you escape the box, then maybe the box was never real to begin with. And let me tell you something. Once a person who's been counted out realizes they have the power to create their own reality, there is no going back. Once they realize, I am not my childhood, I am not my trauma, I am not my mistakes, I am not their opinions, everything changes. You know, it's actually one of the reasons I wrote the Transformation Trilogy, because I realized that so many people spend their entire lives believing that what happened to them is who they are. They think because they came from dysfunction, they'll always live in dysfunction. They think because they experienced trauma, they'll always be defined by trauma. They think because they struggled, suffered, failed, or were counted out that somehow their future was already being decided. And that's simply not true. That's why I wrote Ashes, from survival to stability, Phoenix from stability to power, and Limitless from power to purpose. Because transformation doesn't happen all at once. First, you survive. Then you reclaim your power. Then you discover that you can create a future that is actually greater than your past. And honestly, that's what this entire conversation is about. It's about realizing that your history may explain where you started, but it never gets to decide where you finish. And that's where things really start to change. Because now you're no longer asking permission to become who you are. Now you're building. Now you're creating. Now you're moving. Now you're refusing. Refusing to go backwards. Refusing to settle. Refusing to shrink. Refusing to abandon yourself ever again. And here's what people don't understand. Once someone reaches that point, you can't threaten them with rejection. You can't threaten them with misunderstanding. You can't threaten them with criticism because they've already survived worse. And you know why so many people get so confused when the underdog wins? Because they already decided your story. They already decided your ending. They already decided your limitations. They already decided your ceiling. They looked at your family. They looked at your trauma. They looked at your environment. They looked at your history. And they mentally filed you away. Just another statistic. But then something happened. You learned, you grew, you healed, you adapted, you built, you evolved, and now they're confused. Because according to everything that they believed, you weren't supposed to become this. You weren't supposed to rise. You weren't supposed to succeed. You weren't supposed to build a life greater than your past, but you did. And that's why they don't understand you. Because you shattered the story they wrote about you. And I want to talk directly to the person who's in the trenches right now, the person who's struggling, the person who is doubting themselves, the person who secretly wonders if everyone was right. Listen to me. Where you are is not who you are. What happened to you is not who you are. What you've been through is not who you are. And just because you're in the middle of the story doesn't mean you've reached the end of it. You have power. You have value. You have worth. You have the ability to create something greater. I don't care what society said. I don't care what the statistics said. I don't care what family said. I don't care what your past said. You are still creating your future. And the moment you truly understand that, the game changes. Because here's what happens when someone like you finally wakes up. Setbacks stop being stop signs. They become fuel. Failures stop becoming proof. They become feedback. Rejection stops becoming devastation. It becomes redirection. Misunderstanding stops becoming painful. It becomes confirmation that you're growing beyond what other people can comprehend. And that's why people who have been through the most often become the strongest. Because once you survived hell, you're not afraid of discomfort anymore. You're not afraid of being misunderstood. You're not afraid of losing people. You're not afraid of starting over because you've already proven to yourself that you can survive. Now imagine the version of you 5 years from now who refused to quit. The version of you who stopped asking for permission. The version of you who stopped apologizing for wanting more. The version of you who looked at every setback and said, fine, I'll use this too. That version of you exists. The only thing standing between you and that person is the decision to stop believing the story other people wrote about your life. Because here's the truth. You can look at your past and become the victim. Or you can look at your past and realize it was training. Training for your strength. Training for your wisdom. Training for your resilience. Training for the person that you're becoming. And that's what they never understood. The thing they thought would break you built you. The thing they thought would destroy you prepared you. The thing they thought would define your limits actually revealed your power. And maybe that's why they underestimated you, because they were measuring your past while you were busy creating your future. If you've been counted out, if you've been underestimated, if you've been told you couldn't, let this be the moment you decide that nobody else's opinion gets to determine the rest of your life. Because you are not a statistic. You are a possibility. And your future can absolutely be greater than your past. If this message resonated with you, let me know in the comments. What is one thing that people underestimated about you? And if you're committed to creating a future greater than your past, make sure you subscribe. Peace, blessings, love, and an abundance of power.